Hi, everybody. It's Maynard, Mike, and Brett back with another C.O.B. We're delighted today to have Professor Jesse Jenkins with us. We'll provide you his full bio, but needless to say, he's very distinguished. He's studied at a lot of great places, engineering and energy systems and environmental questions. He is today an assistant professor at Princeton, and he's also a macro-scale engineering systems engineer. You may have heard his name in the energy policy discussions because he's been highly influential, highly sought after, someone who provided a lot of thoughts that ultimately showed up in the IRA. And so we're just delighted to have him. Jesse, he authorized me to make the move to Jesse. So Jesse, welcome. Go Tigers. We're really glad to have you.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, before we jump in with Professor Jenkins, Mike, what do you got today?
Yeah, we got a multitude of things, I suppose. It's been a really interesting week or so. And, so we want to hit like 4 different areas. First, want to hit the economic area. As we all saw last week, the FOMC paused rate hikes, at least temporarily. Today, you had housing starts come out significantly above estimates. And so that's going to probably continue to put pressure on the Fed to basically maybe raise rates. So the markets are down a couple hundred points today on the Dow. From an economic, from a commodity standpoint, like I said, we're down about $1.25, around $70 per barrel. And what we really have is what we've had over the last 2 or 3 months. It's this battle between the financial markets and the physical markets. What does it look like? And we just don't have an answer to that yet. From a market standpoint, from an equity market standpoint, there's this fear of missing out phenomenon going on, right? A lot of money's piling into growth stocks. And so, right now, that is something that is dangerous. You got volatility low. We've talked about this for several weeks, but you know what? The momentum just keeps coming in. Today, we're down to about 300 points in the Dow. But like I said, a lot of momentum coming in. It's going to be really tough to push these guys to the sidelines. From the standpoint of like the last week in energy land, we'd point to sort of 4 deals and 4 events. Well, first of all, we have J.P. Morgan is having an energy, power, renewables conference going on in New York City over the next 2 or 3 days. And so that's going to be really interesting. I think one of the big points that's going to be coming out of that meeting is what is OFS deflation doing? I think people want to get a good feel for that. And so, keep your heads out for a lot of stuff coming out of that. The second thing is I just point to 2 or 3 deals that happened over the last week. We're not going to basically say whether we like the deals or whatever the case may be, just to point them out that there is consolidation happening in the industry. We have obviously today, we have Civitas is literally buying, into the Permian. This is sort of out of basin. They're in the DJ basin. So they basically are saying they're doing it for 3 reasons. For diversity, obviously they want to get out of the basin for diversification, number 1. Number 2, they want to do it for duration, which means longer and extended inventory. They get that. And the third is scale. They're going from roughly $5 billion in enterprise value to a little over $10 billion in enterprise value. So it's an important company. I'd say the other one was last week's announcement of Patterson and Nextier, 2 oil service companies, land rig companies, pressure pumping companies getting together, doubling their EV from sort of $3 billion to $5 billion, $5.5 billion. So another deal. We also talked about the Shell Capital Markets meeting that was hosted last week, and I think a couple things came out of there. A, they increased shareholder distributions. B, traditional fossil fuel energy production, instead of declining, they're going to keep it flattish through 2030. And the other thing that really came out is that they basically said, we're not going to grow for growth's sakes. Renewables, they're going to have to make returns or they're going to be candidates for sale. So I thought that was really important. And the last deal is last night Woodside announced an FID in Mexico, $7.2 billion project. And the reason we want to mention that is it's going to exploration. Now it's going to be development phase. And the reason that's important is because we're still underspending globally and upstream. And this is a good point of we're going to need these deals in 2028, 29, 30, stuff of that nature. So I just wanted to point that out. And the last thing I'd say as we go into this podcast today is ERCOT today essentially said, created a warning for residents of Texas saying, we want you to cut back on electricity voluntarily because we're going to get up to about 83,000 megawatts of demand. That is a record. And the only reason I mention this is because Texas has got a big wind and solar installed base, and so we really need to be smart about how we're thinking about investments going forward, because we do need base load. We need generation of all types. So we'll see how that's tested, and so we'll just go ahead and give it back to you, man.
Yeah, that's interesting. I thought the Woodside, the commentary, it kind of reminded me of Willow, right? Which is like, we are making this investment because we believe long-term, it's a good long-term oil play. And we haven't heard companies talking like that in a long time.
Yeah, I mean, what it points out is there's more beyond shale. There's other stuff going around the world,
that too.
And we need it all. And so just pointing that out, it doesn't show up on the radar screen for a lot of people. And so I thought it was important to talk about it.
Awesome. Well, Jesse, thanks you again so much for joining. It's a delight to meet you. Full credit to Brett. I think you guys work together at the Clean Air Task Force. And so really appreciate you spending some time with us. I think maybe first place that we might ask you to start is just talk a little bit about Princeton and the team there, and that you've done the Net Zero America study. But talk to us about your group, the effort, just kind of the installed base, if you will, the installed energy base at Princeton. That'd be a great place to start.
Yeah. So I just finished my 4th year on the faculty here at Princeton. I run a group that we call the Zero Lab, Zero Carbon Energy Systems Research and Optimization Laboratory. And we're about 20 strong now. So it's grown, steadily over the last 4 years. And if you include the, crew of undergraduates that we get each year to work on senior theses, they, move on, and then we get a new crew the next year. All super talented, as you might expect from Princeton undergrads. We have about 20 folks. So that's spread, kind of evenly across senior researchers. We have professional experts in geospatial modeling and optimization modeling and software. And then we have a number of graduate students across different departments. I'm jointly appointed in the Mechanical and Aerospace department and the Andlinger Center for Energy and the Environment, which is our interdisciplinary center for energy research here. And I'm also affiliated at the School of Public and International Affairs, where the sort of policy-oriented students are. So we have a nice blend of students coming from either engineering backgrounds or policy and economics, political science backgrounds, all working on trying to understand how our energy system is going to evolve at a kind of national or regional scale, what we call macro energy systems, and building models that we can use to help understand that. Those models are mostly based on optimization methods. So we're basically trying to represent the whole energy system. How do we meet future demand for energy services at the lowest cost, subject to economic, policy, and engineering constraints that try to represent how the markets and the physics of electricity, transmission and generation and other things all work. Obviously, like all models, it's abstracted, but does a pretty good job of helping us understand these complicated systems and explore new technologies, new implications of policy and planning decisions. And so we've done a number of kind of high impact studies on the U.S. and our transition towards net zero, starting with the Net Zero America study, which was joint with a couple of other senior researchers here at Princeton, Eric Larson and Chris Gregg, which tried to take a look at multiple pathways that the U.S. could take to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. This report came out in 2020, right in December, right before the inauguration of President Biden and the new 117th Congress, and really tried to drill down into what would we actually have to build beyond the high level commitments you might hear on the campaign trail or the commitments that Shell or other companies might make, to net zero. What does it actually mean from an infrastructure perspective? What does that look like in terms of workforce mobilization, capital mobilization, siting and building wind and solar and transmission projects across the country? Really trying to get down to a more visceral and human scale to identify where some of the key challenges are going to arise as we think about this transition and where we might need to make interventions from a strategic or policy perspective. We followed that up with another study or project we call the Repeat Project, which you can find at repeatproject.org, which then shifted gears from this sort of notional pathway, to net zero, to actually thinking about what policy mechanisms Congress was considering in the White House and how far do they get us on that path. And so we tried to model in as close to real time as possible the federal debate around energy policy. So as Congress was considering the Infrastructure Law or the Build Back Better Act, and then eventually the Inflation Reduction Act. We were modeling those bills as quickly as we could within a matter of weeks after the bills were introduced to try to provide guidance to stakeholders, the press, and policymakers about what the aggregate impact of those bills might be on our energy future. And we continue that project now through at least the end of 2024. And now we're hard at work trying to figure out how to model the new proposed EPA power plant regulations and some of the tailpipe rules they've released for cars and trucks to see how much further those get us down the path.
So there's so much. We're so excited to talk to you because there's so many things we could talk about. I guess the one thing, as you were talking about the effort there, that I kind of wanted to highlight is, you have in your group and in your assemblage of experts, you have engineers, mechanical engineers. Like, this is not, you're not doing this in Excel spreadsheet with a background in political science. I mean, right. You guys are engineering based.
Yeah. So when we have folks that have deep expertise in underlying technologies, that have deep expertise in the computational methods that we use, and expertise in policy and political economy, right? Because if you think about what's going to shape this energy system, it's new technologies, but it's also how we use policy to shape the evolution of our energy system. I mean, energy is so fundamental to every economy, to national security in every country, that it's pervasively shaped by policy interventions. And so we really come at it from both perspectives and try to understand and build modeling tools that help us understand how each of those types of interventions, new innovations in the technology side, new interventions in the policy side, help push the energy system forward.
So maybe just one question, because you sort of touched on it. I think we've seen this in other discussions, which is sometimes it seems like in an energy system, people will approach it and say, look, let's just solve for the right answers and the budget we have. And other times they loosen those constraints. And sometimes they tighten the constraint to say, well, let's solve for what the public will, tolerate or embrace, et cetera. Yeah. On that last one, it's sort of interesting because this stuff is so complicated. Like, if you will attach your repeat work as well as the Net Zero America, we're energy people. You're an energy person. This is wildly complicated stuff. So when you start getting into, does the public understand nuclear? Does the public understand methane leaks? Does the public understand land use? Does the public understand energy density? NIMBYism. You get into all this stuff. Do you guys try to let the public, do you try to take into account public sentiment? Or do you try to say, let's just solve for the answer, and then we'll try to sell the public on why that's the answer? Or maybe that's not even part of your work.
No, I mean, so technically what our models do is solve for the least cost solution subject to whatever constraints you include in the model. I have talked to a lot of policymakers in my day and, answered questions about policy interventions. I've never once heard a policymaker ask for the least cost solution, right? We care about affordability. We don't want energy prices to skyrocket. Politicians don't want to get recalled over energy crises, right? So we care about reliability. We care about affordability, but these are things we sort of satisfy on, particularly affordability, right? Like, we need to keep the lights on. That's a pretty hard constraint. On affordability, like, we want to make sure energy costs don't skyrocket. They maintain affordability for customers, for our business competitiveness. But nobody's really like micromanaging that last cent of savings, right? And that's important because what we have shifted a lot of our research to doing is saying, let's relax the budget constraint by like 10%. Let's give it a little slack. And then let's explore all of the possible solutions that meet the hard physical constraints of the system, right? So we're not violating the rules of physics, that, are consistent with economic markets clearing, but present a range of options to stakeholders and policymakers that help potentially address or mitigate or exacerbate, if you pick the wrong solutions, right? Some of the other many things that we care about that our energy system impacts, whether that's, the economic base in the community that you're from, or it's the way in which siting wind farms impacts the visibility and, desirability of your property value, or it's the way it affects your tax base and whether or not your kids go to really good schools because there's, energy infrastructure paying property taxes, Or what does it mean for the transition of the workforce? How fast does that have to happen? How fast do we have to train, new solar installers or manufacturing, workers? There's all these other dimensions to the energy transition. And we're trying to not say this is the best solution, but to provide a menu of options, but to quantify those trade-offs for people. Because, otherwise we're sort of just going on vibes. And at least we can provide some quantitative insights on the trade-offs and challenges that you might face. And then, let people hash it out, right? I don't expect the public per se to understand all this complexity, but I do expect planners at utilities, policymakers in Congress or, Senate staff and committee staff to try to take in some of this information, the pressures and questions they're getting from their stakeholders and constituents, and then make a pretty complicated multi-objective calculus in their heads, right? And that's how policy and planning decisions really happen in reality, I think.
I think it's interesting. You're raising something. It's reminding us of a book we read, and we had the author on, and we were talking about decision making in public utility commissions. And one of the takeaways was it looked like, first of all, nobody wants to make a decision. They want to design some rules and then have it just happen. And then secondly, there looked like there were some conflicts as people made those decisions. And then the other observation you started to have about this whole structure we have is, because you mentioned reliability, right? And this is an oversimplification, but I got a smart guy, and you'll correct me because if I'm wrong. In the old system, if the power went out, somebody got fired. In the new system, there's finger pointing because, well, you said this rule and the legislature did this and then the PUC did this and so there seems to be less accountability. And now I know this is a sweeping comment, but as we think about reliability, affordability, and then as low an impact as possible, it seems like people are making decisions where they're not going to be held accountable for reliability issues. Is that something you notice in our system? Because we're in Texas. We're getting warnings about, don't use the power because unfortunately, there's all these issues down here. But do you think that's the case? Is that, as you've looked at our power systems, have we messed up incentives in that particular category?
I mean, I think to some degree, what we've done is we've disaggregated the responsibility, right? And that was kind of intentional, right? We went from vertically integrated monopolies who, sure, there's one CEO in charge of that whole darn thing, but also there's only one. And so if they're not very good, right, or they make the wrong decision, right, that impacts everybody, right? So we went from that system of like, okay, let's try to get some good regulation in place, some good planning, treat it like a traditional monopoly to, and this is not universally true, this is about 60% of the country, right? We went to markets as a way to unleash competition, particularly in generation, but sometimes in retail as well, retail supply, and to aggregate a lot of the wisdom of the market, right? Like we do in so many other markets, to try to guide more efficient decision making and ultimately deliver lower costs and while maintaining that reliability incentive. And there are different market tools to do that. Some work better than others. Some like to fly a little closer to the sun than others. Texas is one of those states that, is okay kind of running a little close to the reserve margin than other places like PJM where I live, which is, runs a pretty hefty reserve margin. And, that helps when things get tight. So I think, what's happened is we've sort of disaggregated the decision-making. And when that happens, then you also have the opportunity to point fingers at other people and say, well, it wasn't my fault. It was your decision, not mine. Yeah. And so, I think to some degree that does reduce accountability. I would hope it doesn't eliminate it. I mean, look, people lost billions of dollars, right, on some of their investment decisions. So there's some accountability. The entire staff of ERCOT, or the entire Texas Public Utilities Commission resigned after Superstorm Uri. Maybe they should have stuck around actually and faced a bit more accountability, right, and solved the mess that they created rather than walk away. But and then the legislature tried to act, right? Took a lot of hearings and, unfortunately, when legislatures are pretty political animals and not maybe the best at solving these technical problems. And so they proposed a whole lot of stuff that didn't actually address the problem. But I think there is ultimately accountability when there's blackouts, particularly the severity that you had in Texas, like, some heads roll and action should be taken. And that's the appropriate response. It's just that it's a lot more disaggregated problem. And so you've created a more complicated machine that you need to figure out how to tune up than the older machine with the kind of vertically integrated utility. There's pros and cons, right, to that.
So maybe, I know we've got a lot to cover. You've agreed to spend an hour with us, and we're already worried about running out of time. But in the Net Zero America study, you talk about some pathways to getting to net zero, and then they're sort of different flavors, casseroles with different levels of various flavors. Do you want to just touch on, I don't mean to take you through all those scenarios, but just maybe touch on some of the key themes of those scenarios, just so people have a sense of your thinking?
Yeah. And, these are only 5 pathways. There's an infinite number, right? So we try to pick 5 illustrative pathways. And the way we did that was by basically varying kind of 3 big levers that we have in our toolkit. The first is how much we rely on electrification of demand. So all these scenarios, any decarbonization pathway, the electricity sector is kind of the linchpin for the whole thing, because A, it's responsible for about 1/4 of our greenhouse gas emissions now. We got to eliminate that. But B, we can also expand the role of clean electricity and decarbonize and displace fossil energy use in transportation, in heating buildings through heat pumps, in industrial electrification through high temperature resistance heating or low temperature heat pumps, or by making hydrogen as a clean fuel that then can be used in some of those sectors. And so demand for electricity in all these scenarios grows a lot.
And do you mind just giving us that number? Because I think
so somewhere between 150% and 300%. There's one outlier scenario, which I'll get to, which is the 100% renewables primary energy supply. That one, actually, you need 4 times as much electricity in 2050 as you produce today. The other scenarios are like 120 to 150, 170% more than we use now. And what was actually interesting in that scenario is, so we varied the degree of end use electrification, right? So how much do we rely on electric vehicles? How far can heat pumps go in cold weather climates, like the northern part of the country? And so we had a scenario that was like all the way basically, full saturation of electrification, and then a scenario that was only about half of that. And interestingly, what we found actually is that scenario with less electrification of end uses actually used more total electricity, because what it did was produce a whole bunch of hydrogen that was then used in synthetic fuels like synthetic natural gas or liquids that we needed more of because we weren't directly using electricity. And that was a lot less efficient than directly using electricity. And so it actually needed a whole lot of bulk electricity supply. It just was being used for other purposes than directly powering our buildings or our transportation. And so kind of we came out of that with like, there's no way around needing a whole ton of new clean electricity. The question is, how do we use it? Do we use it indirectly or directly? So that was the first kind of lever, high, low electrification of end uses. The other piece was, how much do we rely on bioenergy? So we could, take biomass from corn crops or from, perennial grasses like switchgrass or miscanthus. When they grow, they absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. And then we can use those crops to either make hydrogen and take all the CO2 that was in the crops and sequester it underground. That's a negative emissions process. So we get clean hydrogen and negative CO2 emissions there that could let us continue to use some fossil fuels in things like jet fuel or petrochemical production, things of very high value. Or we could actually produce synthetic liquids or plastics or other things because they're hydrocarbons. So we can take the corn crop and take it apart molecularly and refashion it as jet fuel or plastic or diesel. And so we explored those options because that, the amount of bioenergy you can get sustainably without negatively impacting demand for food or pushing agriculture globally into, lands that are less productive than our prime farmlands here in the US, that's a big variable. And so we did scenarios that were very constrained in the amount of biomass. That basically didn't allow us to dedicate any more land than we currently devote to growing corn for ethanol into bioenergy uses, to a scenario where we said, heck, let's just use everything we've got. And so that was one other lever. And in the low electrification scenarios, the ability to use more biomass derived liquids and gases fuels is pretty important. So that's a big lever there. And then the final one is, how much do we rely on renewable electricity? So wind and solar primarily. We had scenarios where we said, let the model pick how much makes sense economically. And then we had scenarios where we constrained the build out to reflect a whole bunch of potential constraints, whether it's supply chain or transmission build out or, siting concerns around wind and solar, to reduce it by about half of what we saw in the peak amount in the first scenario. And then a scenario where we said, let's assume we're not going to use any fossil fuels or nuclear power at all. We're only going to use wind and solar and hydro and geothermal for all of our primary energy needs. And eventually by 2050, phase out fossil fuels, phase out nuclear. And so that was the 100% renewable type scenario. That one uses about twice as much renewable energy as the base kind of scenario. So that was the other big lever we looked at. And the ones where you constrain renewables, what we need is a lot more other carbon-free electricity, largely nuclear power in our modeling, but it could be advanced geothermal or natural gas with carbon capture, but something else that can produce power without needing to site a bunch of wind and solar. And then you also probably need a lot of direct air capture to complement the negative emissions you can get from biomass to allow us to keep using a bit more fossil energy in end uses and offset those emissions by taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. So we got a good sense of like, if you push on this lever, this is what compensates, across these sort of big tools in our toolbox.
And did you have, as you solve for that, I mean, I'm hearing you used a lot of electricity in the Cray that was calculating that model. I'm joking, nobody talks about the Cray anymore. But did you have constraints on reliability and cost? Like, as you said, don't let it get more than this, and it can't be this much solar and wind.
Yeah, so we model the reliability piece in two ways. One, we model hourly operations of the power sector because it's the tightest physical constraints to make sure that we can ramp production up and down and we can meet all the variability in wind and solar. We use a little bit of flexibility in how you charge EVs to help on the demand side. We use batteries to fill in some of it. A lot of it comes from hydrogen electrolysis. So when we have an abundance of supply, we produce hydrogen, we save it, and then we burn it in natural gas power plants to produce power on demand. That there's a lot of capacity in our system still. In all the cases, we have about as much what we call firm generating capacity as we do today, somewhere between 500 and 1,000 gigawatts of firm generation. That's generation that's on whenever you need it for as long as you need it. And then what varies is how much energy we get from the wind and solar versus the firm options. But we have a lot of standby capacity basically that's there. And either it's nuclear power, so it's generating all the time, or it's hydrogen combustion, where it's generating very infrequently because it's expensive, but it provides a lot of reliability value. So we make sure all that lines up along with capacity planning margins that you would see in most of the country. So reliability is a hard constraint. Cost is what we're minimizing in these scenarios, subject to other constraints. And interestingly, what we found is there's really all of these transitions are completely transformative. We have to rebuild the entire energy infrastructure of the country, but actually on an annual cost of energy services basis, quite affordable. We estimate that you spend somewhere between 4 and 6% of our GDP on energy services going forward in all of these net zero pathways. That compares to somewhere between 5 and 8% that we've spent historically on energy services during prosperous times in American history. So it's not going to break the bank, but it does require mobilizing a lot of upfront capital investment because we're talking about a lot of capital intensive assets like grid infrastructure or nuclear power plants or wind. And then they pay back over time in lower energy costs. So there's a capital mobilization challenge, but annual affordability is actually quite reasonable in all these scenarios.
So I think it's this last one where we're going to have to ask you, man, that's hard to get your head around, right? Which is, because you just said, rebuild the whole energy infrastructure. We're going to have flavors like hydrogen, which we do not have at scale right now. So there's going to be a lot of execution risk. And you're also going to have a system which, we can debate it, but when you look at it, you'll say, oh boy, that does not look as reliable. So surely there's going to be more redundancy and that drives up costs. So I think all of that, it was that last part, Jesse, where probably a bunch of energy types like us go, oh boy, that's got to cost more. And how can that really be as reliable?
Yeah. So, I mean, on the reliability side, again, we have as much firm generating capacity in this system as we do today. So we're not talking about getting rid of all of our gas plants or nuclear plants.
We are ramping electricity usage, though.
We are, and much of that new demand is very flexible. So you think about it, a lot of that's electrolyzers, which can turn off whenever the grid is stressed, right? Just like Bitcoin does in Texas right now. And then a lot of it is EVs, which again, like I have a 300-mile range EV now. That's enough for me to drive for an entire week on a single charge. So I can choose, if I have the right incentives, when to charge, not just overnight, but even which day. And we don't take full advantage of that in our modeling. We only assume about half of EVs are shifting by a few hours. And even that's enough to balance a lot, along with, again, storage, energy storage for batteries, which are getting increasingly cheap and being built at kind of gigawatt scale. So, I don't know, we can go into more detail on how the model works, but this is what I do for a living, is model power systems. We meet all those constraints. You can't do it with wind, solar, and batteries alone, but you can with wind, solar, batteries, and a bunch of firm power. And that's kind of how you meet the reliability side.
Here's, I think, one question, because we've all been around these big financial models forever, right? Like Exxon has a corporate model. Every company has a corporate model. Every research analyst has a model. The IPCC has modeled the climate for the next 100 years. Like, you're modeling the whole energy system. We all know you change one variable and like it multiplies out a gazillion times and you could have a whole new answer. Like, how do you do all that modeling? How do you stress test it? Just the complications of that are stunning.
Yeah, I mean, so we did about 160, I think, sensitivity cases with exactly those kinds of things. And like not 20% changes, but like 2 or 10x changes in variables to figure out which, if any of those, actually drive a substantial change in either the composition of the system, right? To understand what our kind of fallback options are. This doesn't work, then you do that instead, right? Or what actually drives the cost of decarbonization. And what we found is there are really only about half a dozen of those that really drive the cost picture. And usually it's like more than one thing has to fail, right, for it to work. Because if you just take one solution out, there's usually an alternative. If you take out 4 or 5 solutions, then all of a sudden costs start to go up. And so if you want to check out the report, we have a very extensive sensitivity analysis section to try to identify those. And I should say, like, what we're not trying to give people a plan that you would enact now and follow every step of that plan for the next 30 years without looking at the world, right? What we're trying to say is, let's model all these scenarios and let's figure out, of all those pathways, how do they all start? What would be the best actions to take now that give us the greatest chance of success, that hedge against the downside risks of things going wrong? So we, maybe spend a little bit more to have some hedging value, right? Maybe I don't need that solution, but if I do, I sure as heck want to have it around when I need it rather than have it be immature. And that's really how we focused our recommendations, was like, okay, what do you do over the next decade, given how we know the pathways may diverge in the future? Because we're going to be able to update this plan every couple of years, right? Going forward, right? We're not locking ourselves in forever. And that was really that's a robust kind of decision-making under uncertainty kind of approach to this problem. And that's, largely what Congress did, is enact a kind of soup to nuts, let's do everything, try to get everything moving kind of approach to policymaking, which in this kind of context, I think is actually the right way to go.
Let me ask you about that. The soup to nuts approach, which, we've all heard, all of the above, and let's try everything. And I think we all at some level get that logic. But there's another approach, which I kind of think about as the Defense Department, we need a new jet fighter approach. They say we need a new jet fighter. They get 5 submissions. To the best of their ability, they choose that jet fighter and they build it. And they hope they got it right. So we haven't done, I guess the only way I think of that we could have done that in energy, if you think about the IRA, is we could have said, okay, we know nuclear works. Build 30 of those things. We know natural gas, it may not be perfect, but it's better than coal. Boom, pull the trigger on that. We know solar and wind are great, but we don't have the batteries yet, so build them up to X%. Like, do you think sometimes about the alternative approach? Because, nuclear is one that sticks out relative to, say, doing large-scale hydrogen, which we've never done. What do you think about a different approach like that? I'm just curious.
So I think where that kind of the fighter jet procurement approach might work is for individual technologies. But just like a general, like going to war with a full set of tools in your arsenal, right? We need that because this is a huge, complicated energy system, right? So we don't just need nuclear power to work or hydrogen to work or carbon capture to work. We need something like that for all of them, right? So if nuclear doesn't work, we need, some combination of geothermal or renewables and really cheap long duration storage or carbon capture, alum cycle natural gas plants with carbon capture, so like we need substitutes if they don't work as well. Because we can't afford to lose the battle, right? We got to win. We only get one shot at it too. So, there may be specific technologies that you're trying to pull into the market that you do want to take a kind of competitive procurement approach. And Brett and I have talked about this on Twitter a few times. Nuclear is one of those ones where you kind of probably do need to do that because each design is going to be a little different. We know there's not a lot of standardization. It's not like a lithium ion cell, right? Where you build billions of these things in a factory and you just assemble them in different ways. And like you get really good at building those cells. You're going to build dozens of nuclear power plants, not billions of cells. And so, at some point, if you want to get learning and you want to get good at it, you probably do need to pick one or two standardized designs and then just go build 30 of them, like you said. The challenge from a policy perspective is that nuclear powers and the nuclear industry has not inspired a ton of confidence in recent years that they will be able to execute on time and on budget with taxpayer money, footing a lot of the bill. And that's a really big bet. If you're going to commit to 15 or 30 nuclear power plants, that's like a tens to hundreds of billions of dollar bet. And if it doesn't go right, well, it's not just like you don't have, that's a lot of money to, people are not willing to take that risk as a politician, basically. And DOD gets insulated from that to some degree because they have an enormous budget. But even then, if they invested $50 billion in a fighter jet program that totally failed, like the Assistant Secretary of Defense would be fired. And like the generals who ran that procurement program would be fired and there would be consequences, right? So it's just a question of like, can we afford to take that large a bet on nuclear? I would be willing to do it personally, I think, but like, I'm not, I understand why there's reticence to do that. And there's also a plethora of options. So like, do we let 1,000 flowers bloom for a little while before we go and down select? That's a really legitimate question too, because if you pick one design now and it turns out that there was a better one that was just 3 years behind that and you kind of shut them off and cut them out of the market, that could also be damaging. So these are the kinds of like practical questions you have to figure out. Sector by sector, technology by technology, what's the best way to get them into the market?
Well, and this, I think, gets to how much money is too much? How much is too much? Because if I buy $200 billion of nuclear reactors and they're 50% over, okay, now it's $300 billion. But I have the reactors and they work. We can build them. So some of this other stuff, it's just not clear. And the budget, I think there was a Goldman report that sort of suggested maybe the IRA gets to over $1 trillion. Like to its credit, it's an incentive program that could have more money. But how do we, in this environment you're describing, how do we create efficient spending? Right? Because we're doing like wartime spending, not efficient spending.
Well, not quite. I mean, we're spending a fraction of 1% of GDP on this, right? Wartime spending would be like 20% of GDP. So it's a reasonable bet, I think.
But Jesse, $400 billion is a lot of money, right? I mean, it's GDP.
Well, $1 trillion. So let's put it in perspective though. $1 trillion over 10 years is $100 billion average spend. We have a $3 trillion budget. So it's actually not that much money. It's a fraction. I mean, the Defense Department spends what, $700 billion a year? So we should be clear. It is not wartime spending. It is nowhere near that. It is a increase in our annual spend. That's not nothing. I know $1 trillion is $1 trillion, but it's worth keeping in mind that it is over 10 years or even longer potentially. And so it's not a huge increase in our annual budgets.
I guess you're right on the math. It's a wartime mentality, I guess is what I'm saying. Let's try it all. Let's fund it all. Yep. Let's see what happens.
And again, this is just one of those areas where like we have a philosophical question. Do you just set the carrots out there and then let the market figure it out because you think that's the best way to sort this out? Or do you run some kind of technocratic procurement program where ultimately somebody at DOE gets to decide which nuclear companies are going to succeed and which ones are going to fail. Those are just two different ways of doing it. I think, largely Congress has been more comfortable with the let's set these incentives and then let the market innovate approach than the let's, run this as if it's a military procurement program. I don't know if that's the right answer, but it is the one that Congress clearly picked.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the IRA, but I'm just going to go ahead and switch subjects. You mentioned earlier about ERCOT, and I would agree with you that we tend to push up against reserve requirements, but I would say some of that is because demand is growing, population is growing, so this is something we're always going to be playing catch up on. So I get that, but I will also say that we're sort of a one-state mentality, and that's been a lot of the downplay. A lot of the backlash against Texas is you don't open your grid to anybody else, and you know what? Guess what? Whatever happens is your own fault. I guess my question is going forward, I think PJM is assumed to be one of the best grid operators out there. You have 13 states involved in this, but it seems like a lot of states are doing different things. How much more difficult is it going to be over the next 4, 5, 6, 10 years for all these different states doing different things for PJM to basically stay on top of this and not get themselves in a situation like ERCOT is and all of a sudden have them scrambling? Just what are your thoughts there? Because I heard someone a couple of weeks ago say that ERCOT, PJM is going to have to cut a couple of states out of PJM if they don't start acting them. What are your thoughts about the background there and the potential for issues like ERCOT to happen to PJM in the next 8, 9, 10 years?
To be fair, we just saw the report from NERC on Winter Storm Elliott, which hit the PJM and Southeast regions. And it reads exactly like the report for Uri in Texas, which is that basically the problem in both cases was we count on natural gas power plants to be firm, to be there when you need them for as long as you need them. And in the summer, that's true. And in the winter, if it's cold, then your gathering lines and your production wells in the Marcellus or in the Permian or wherever start to freeze up, and demand for heating skyrockets at the same time. And some of your power plants fail because they're not weatherized properly. And all that gets correlated together. You end up with tens of gigawatts of supposedly firm power plants failing. And, I testified in Congress after Uri on this. We know that wind and solar are unreliable, right? We know the wind doesn't blow all the time. We know the sun doesn't shine all the time. That's not a newsflash for a grid operator. I call them reliably unreliable, meaning that we plan on that. And if you go look at the winter, reliability report for PJM or for Texas, they count on no solar at all because they know it gets dark at night, and they count on very little wind output. I think in Texas it was like 7% capacity factor during a winter storm. The average is more like 35%. And so they know that that's going to happen. But what they count on is gas plants showing up when you need them. And they count on coal plants. And they count on nuclear plants, right? These are the ones that are supposed to carry us in those circumstances. And when they fail, people die, right? That's what happened in Texas. That, what happened could have happened in PJM if we didn't have a large regional grid to draw on, right? To help balance things out. We came real close. So I think that's worth keeping in mind that there was a lot of finger pointing that happened after Uri. There's going to be, more after Elliott. But if you read the actual reports, they're very clear. It's, vulnerabilities in the winter in our natural gas systems that correlate with high winter peaking, heat demand that are really a key vulnerability that I think a lot of our markets need to address. New England has been dealing with this for a long time because you can't get gas to New England in the winter because of pipeline constraints. And so they already had to deal with this a few times, and they have, dual fuel requirements to switch to oil, and they have an LNG terminal for backup. And, there's ways in which they've tried to winterize. But I think the mid-Atlantic and the South, they've not fully grappled with winter vulnerabilities because historically they've been planning for summer peaks from air conditioning. So I think this is just a real key planning challenge, and we need to do, grid planners and everybody else need to do a better job addressing it. It won't go away. It's only going to get more serious as we electrify heating. Although I should say in the Southeast, if you switch from resistance heating to heat pumps, you actually lower winter peak demand. Same with Texas, because heat pumps are a lot more efficient, even in cold weather, than resistance heating. So that helps on, weatherize homes, switch to heat pumps. That would reduce the demand spiking side of the equation. And then if you weatherize gas plants in our pipeline system, we'd be in a lot better shape. So in terms of like, how does PJM manage this? I mean, I think what PJM does well, in contrast to Texas, is it has this forward procurement of capacity where it's trying to plan out 3 years in advance how much capacity we think we're going to need. And it offers effectively hedging contracts, options contracts to generators who are willing to commit to come online or continue to operate in the future. There's probably better ways even to improve the design of those markets, but at least having that sort of like, let's do this a little more proactively instead of wait for the scarcity and, price spikes to drive new investment, which is the kind of Texas approach. It's definitely I think historically it's been a lot more expensive approach for PJM. I think, the average cost of electricity in Texas is a lot cheaper. But if you want more insurance against those really high, price periods and the risks of blackouts, that's what we're paying for in PJM. We're paying for insurance.
Jesse, super cool and fascinating conversation so far. But, I think kind of in one of the trends that I've heard in a lot of what your models and the work you guys look at, and I've even seen you guys, focusing a bit on it recently on Twitter, is, hydrogen and, the role of sort of electrolyzers and hydrogen on the grid writ large when we start looking at their impact, versus just, looking at them as solely as the small sort of generation sources that they might be coming on right now. And I know, many advocates, yourself, others were very excited by the IRA tax credit levels, the sliding scale for, emissions based credits for hydrogen and everything. But then, as I said, I think I've seen a lot of discussion from you and from others around, potential unintended consequences or the perhaps the quote unquote sidestepping of legislative intent and everything around this and the additionality sort of discussion. So can you kind of like elaborate on what's really going on around this hydrogen tax credit discussion and what the goals are here?
Yeah, so this is one of the big new incentive programs in the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, as I call it, and this is the Clean Hydrogen Production Tax Credit, Section 45V, and this is meant to really kickstart what is totally nascent, market for electrolyzers today, and try to repeat some of the past success that we've seen for wind and solar power and batteries and LEDs and other technologies that are kind of mass manufactured like that, where initially, like if you went back 10 years ago, these were niche alternative energy technologies, we used to call them, right? Super expensive, way more than the current market rate. And they required proactive and robust policy support to get the markets off the ground, to drive investment, to drive economies of scale and manufacturing, to drive innovation and incremental improvements in how we build these things, to drive, experience in the crews that construct projects. All of that's driven down the cost of solar and batteries by roughly an order of magnitude, about 90% over a decade, and wind by about 2/3. And so what we'd like to do is do the same thing for electrolyzers, right? They're expensive, niche, nascent technology today. And in a decade, we'd like them to be a mainstream tool in our toolkit so that in the 2030s and 2040s, they can help drive deeper decarbonization by, say, fueling long-haul trucking that's difficult to electrify, or making ammonia for fertilizer and displacing natural gas, or running high temperature industrial processes, or making steel through direct reduction of iron instead of blast furnaces. Like there's just a lot of things you can do with hydrogen that may be hard to do with other clean energy options. And the nice part about hydrogen is, like electricity, it's a carbon-free energy carrier. So that means when you use it, it doesn't produce any CO2. And so as long as you can produce it in a carbon-free way, you've got a nice, tool for decarbonization. That's why electricity is so handy too, because it doesn't itself emit CO2 when you consume electricity. You just have to produce it in a clean way. But that's the catch right now. How do we actually produce hydrogen in a clean way? The statute is very clear about this in the sense that if you want to get the full $3 kilogram subsidy, which is worth more than twice the market price of hydrogen today, and is probably necessary for any electrolyzer project to get off the ground in the near term, you have to be basically 95 to 98% cleaner than conventional methane reforming with natural gas, which is how we make all of our hydrogen today. So not just a little bit cleaner, not just break even so that you're kind of, you're displacing natural gas and not causing any increase in emissions, but basically zero emissions, 0.45 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of hydrogen versus about 10 to 14 for methane reforming. And then the real big question in terms of implementation is, how do you demonstrate that you're using clean electricity to make clean hydrogen, particularly when you're plugged into the broader grid where all the electrons just get, munged together and you can't really route from a supplier to a consumer. This has become a very heated debate. My group and a graduate student, Wilson Ricks, have published really, I think, the only peer-reviewed study on this topic so far, looking at different rules for implementation that would require different kind of accounting approaches to prove that you're using clean electricity if you want to claim this tax credit. And the way to do that, in our view, and we've demonstrated this in our modeling, is to basically mimic what would happen if you were directly connected to a clean source. Like, say you just plug right into a nuclear plant or a wind farm, then you know that the electricity you're consuming is coming from a clean source. To do that on the grid, you have to prove three things: that there's a new supply you've contracted with somewhere, so new clean energy has been added to the grid to match your demand, that it's deliverable to the location where you're consuming on the grid, and that it's temporally matched so that it's producing when you're consuming. And if you do that, then you're basically mimicking what would happen if you were just directly plugged in to a clean supply, and we can call that clean, and you can claim your tax credit. Those are the rules that we've proposed. We've shown in our peer-reviewed research that it achieves the sufficient goal of proving that you're close to zero carbon. The Europeans have adopted the same three pillars framework of new supply, deliverability, and hourly matching, with a kind of phase-in process over the next few years. And we're very much hoping that the Treasury Department ends up in the same place here in the US, because if we violate any one of those rules, it's actually very easy to end up with emissions that are worse than methane reforming. And the reason for that is that if you think about natural gas, methane reforming is about 80% efficient. So I get about 80% of the energy in the gas as in hydrogen. If you instead run that hydrogen through a natural gas plant and you lose about half of it, and then you run that electricity through an electrolyzer and you lose another 25% of it, you're left with, something like 30% of what you started with, 30 to 40% of what you started with. And so it's about half as efficient as just using the methane directly. And so if we end up plugging these electrolyzers in and they end up basically consuming natural gas power, it's easy for the emissions rate to be very high, much worse than doing nothing at all. And we need to avoid that outcome to meet the statutory intent of the law, and to avoid having emissions go up by, several hundred million tons, while we're supposedly subsidizing clean hydrogen production, right? That is driving emissions up. So it's become a very heated debate, lots of money at stake here because it's a big, rich tax credit. We think there's a way to do this very correctly, that, we can talk about how long it takes to phase in these rules to give a little implementation time and wiggle room for the first couple gigawatts of projects to get built. But I expect this to be an S curve like we've seen for early adoption of other technologies, where it starts out real slow, but then once things fall in line, you're going to get to that kind of rocket ship phase where it just shoots straight up. And by the time we're there, we need to have strong rules in place, or we could very easily grandfather in a lot of really dirty electrolysis production, getting a lot of really fat taxpayer subsidies to drive up CO2 emissions. And that is absolutely not what we can afford to do.
So Jesse, I'm so sorry we're going to run out of time with you here in a handful of minutes. I guess maybe just a big picture question for you. Two big picture questions is, I think if you see, I noticed there was some congressional testimony recently from some power executives, and one of the themes was, don't ask me to switch to the new thing. Don't ask me to give up the old thing until the new thing is really ready. Right? And so there is this question about investing in oil and gas, investing in coal, investing in the existing system, the pipelines, et cetera, so that you don't create a bottleneck, which then creates a huge spike. So that's kind of one question for you. I think the other one, if you don't mind hitting a twofer for me, is when you think about all this money and effort that we're going to undertake here, and you think about the fundamental goal, which is to reduce CO2 and attack the climate problem, when you just think about the ways that we could spend that money globally, you're obviously struck by the US is not that dirty of an energy system, relatively speaking. There are plenty of systems out there that are really dirty, or, et cetera. So if you want to attack climate and you want to do it fast, is changing our system the best way to do it, or is helping India build nuclear and natural gas and solar and wind a better way to do it? I understand why there might be some issues there, but help us understand the old system and also just the finding costs on pulling CO2 out, and is this the best way to do it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are surely going to be more, like dollar per ton efficient strategies than what Congress just enacted. But I think it's important to do any of us think we're going to send $1 trillion of US taxpayer money to help build projects in India, Nigeria, and elsewhere? I mean, we barely send a few tens of billions of dollars on, mostly on low cost loans that get paid back, right, for foreign aid. And it's always getting attacked, in Congress. So there's a theoretical world in which we kind of distribute the work evenly across the world and we do the cheapest thing first. But that's just so far from the political reality that we face that I don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about it, to be honest. What I think we're going to do, and the biggest thing that we can do for the world, is to use our financial wherewithal and our technological leadership to build advanced energy technologies in the United States, to drive them down in cost, and then to make them available for the world at a cost they can afford. And we've already done that for LEDs. They're 98% cheaper than they were in 2010, right? So the cheapest way to get lighting around the world is now an LED that consumes 5 watts instead of an incandescent bulb that consumes 100. Solar power is now the cheapest way to get electricity almost everywhere. It's 90% cheaper than it was a decade ago. That's thanks to big investments made in richer countries like Germany and Spain and the United States to buy that solar down the cost curve. And so we're going to do the same thing now under IRA for hydrogen, for advanced batteries, for carbon capture, hopefully for advanced nuclear and advanced geothermal, for a whole range of technologies that today are nascent and where, solar or wind or batteries were a decade ago. But with a concentrated push from the US and Europe, for that matter, who's also doing the same thing, and China is also doing the same thing, over the next decade, we can transform those technologies through innovation and cost declines and improvement. And then that opens up new development opportunities for the rest of the world, where if you're India and you're looking at what's the best way to actually complement my energy security and grow my economy, it's just to pick the cleaner option, not the dirty option. I think that's the best thing we can do for the world and to accelerate climate change reduction and climate mitigation around the world. And the probably most practical politically, right? We're not going to give away $1 trillion directly to developing countries, as much as that may be the best way to go from a CO2 perspective.
Well, and you're right. I don't see us wiring them $1 trillion anytime soon. But I guess the original vision of some of the accords was the developed countries would put money in a bucket and get it to the developing nations.
That was the vision. And we've struggled to make that vision real, even to the tune of $100 billion globally, which was the commitment at Paris. The Paris Agreement in 2014 or 2015, right? We have yet to even materialize that. So I think there's arguably a moral responsibility to do it, but we're just not doing it. And so what we can do is invest substantial amounts of money to make these technologies cheaper in a way that's a win-win for the US and the world. And that's what we're doing with IRA. In terms of how do we keep the existing infrastructure while we build the new one? I mean, I think that's honestly one of the advantages of the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law is that they're not sticks, they're carrots. Right there, let's put the money out there to drive investment and drive innovation in the new stuff. As it comes online, it'll displace the old stuff, but we're not going to force the old stuff offline early. And I think that's what we see in our modeling is a transition, right? And we're going to keep using oil and gas, although I think we're at the point where we've now peaked in domestic consumption of oil and petroleum products. We're at a plateau that'll probably turn to a downturn over the next few years as EV adoption continues and as fuel economy improvements in the rest of the fleet continue. I think we're probably going to see peak in US consumption of natural gas as well. Our modeling shows something like a 15 to 20% reduction in consumption by 2035 in both oil and natural gas, petroleum products and natural gas. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to stop producing the stuff. Maybe we export more as we consume less domestically, right? That's always been Saudi Arabia's strategy, right? Is use nuclear power or other solar power or other things to reduce their own domestic consumption so they can export more to the world. We may do the same thing. But we are in this moment where we're pivoting from, since we discovered oil and gas, we've been using more and more of it year in and year out for our entire history, except for a few year blips during recessions. We've now, I think, reversed that trend. We're now going to see sustained declines in US and European demand for oil, petroleum products and gas. And that's a real big regime shift for the industry to deal with. again, that doesn't mean we'll see a peak in US production in the near term. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. But the transition is beginning in earnest. And these are, again, they're sort of S curves. So they start out slow and then they gather real steam. And so I think that this next decade is going to be really interesting as we start to see those S curves ramp up and the transition moving forward. But it's going to be the new stuff displacing the old stuff that drives that transition under the current policy framework. It's not going to be a scheduled, retirement requirement or something like that. It's not going to be a binding emissions cap. It's not an onerous set of regulations. It's a set of incentives.
Do you want to tease us as we wrap up with just, as you think about technology change over the next decade, what's the thing that gets you the most excited that we could be so much better at over the next 10 years that we're not there yet? Like what's the biggest, what's the excitement technologically that gets you most pumped up?
I think there's two things for me. I think one is the ongoing EV revolution, right? The fact that we're just seeing, the industry has basically decided, all right, this is our future now. We're going to throw our weight behind it. And speaking of transitions, like, GM and Ford, they're using profits from their big SUVs and trucks to finance that capital investment in that transition. So like they're in the midst of doing that now in a very different way than the oil and gas industry, by the way, who's not investing their windfall profits in growth businesses in clean energy. They're giving it back to shareholders, right? So very different signal about where they're going. But I'm really excited to see the range of new offerings and the costs come down as supply chains ramp up for EVs. They're just better cars, right? They're amazingly fun to drive. They're quiet. They're clean. They're going to reduce air pollution, asthma, particulate emissions, smog in our cities for our kids, that we're breathing every day. I think that's just going to be really exciting as that starts to ramp up. And the other one is I've spent years, as Brett knows, making the case for the need to proactively invest in clean, firm power technologies, the things we need to complement weather-dependent wind and solar and short-duration batteries or demand flexibility, and ultimately replace our natural gas plants and coal and existing nuclear. And, when I started on that, there was nothing, right? We had we were building Vogtle and VC Summer nuclear plants, and that was about it. Those didn't go quite as planned as I thought in 2014. But these are all kind of, hydrogen combustion, advanced geothermal, all these advanced nuclear technologies. We're just on the drawing board, like in people's minds or in our academic modeling. Now we're going to see first commercial projects for all of those technologies built over the next 3 to 5 years. And we'll find out which ones work, right? And hopefully they all do. But we have enough shots on goal, whether it's the alum cycle, advanced, for emissions-free natural gas combustion with carbon capture. It's a half dozen different advanced nuclear technologies. It's closed loop or enhanced geothermal. It's 100% hydrogen combustion turbines. All these options are going to be built in the next few years. And with that many shots on goal, I'm pretty confident that we're going to win, right? We're going to come out with probably several scores there. And that's going to change the playbook for the next decade, right? Because now you're going to have real demonstrated options for utilities to pick from when it comes time to replace or augment their existing fossil generators. They're going to have clean options to choose from that just aren't there today. And that's pretty exciting too.
Well, I wish we could keep rolling, guys, but unfortunately we're out of power, out of time. But Jesse, we really appreciate you spending time with us. I was thinking some of those Princeton kids, if they want to come down and hang out with us, tell them we got future of energy jobs for them right here.
All right. Yeah, send the job postings up. We're always looking at cool opportunities for kids.
All right. Well, come see us in Houston. Thanks so much, Jesse. We appreciate your time. Thanks, everybody.